Hi. In this set of lectures, we're going to talk about networks. Networks have become an incredibly popular topic for a variety of reasons. One is the internet has allowed us to make all sorts of network connections with people and to give us graphs of those networks. So we're just more aware that networks exist. Another thing is that we get more and more data on networks. We're beginning to see the importance of networks for all sorts of things, whether it's scientific innovation, whether it's the spread of ideas, whether it's the polarization of political thought, and whether it's the rise of or the decrease in smoking or the rise of social trends. You can see these effects through networks using new techniques. What we want to do in this set of lectures is understand a little bit about how networks work and why they're so important. So first, I just want to convince you that networks have become a hot topic. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull up a couple of graphs from Google Ngram. And what this does is it looks at the frequency with which words are used over time. So it basically they've scanned in millions of books, and this tells you the frequency of particular words. So the first word we're going to look at is interstate. So this would have been popular during the peak of the interstate highway system, and that was being built during the 1950s. And in fact, that's what you see. You see this curve going up and then going down. If you look at the frequency of the word network, what you see is you see something that goes on very low, and then boom, it takes off like this. And when you look at this, you might want to say, oh, look, there's a tip. We've got a tip right here. But remember, no, that's probably not the case. This is probably just a standard growth process. This is probably just a standard growth process where interest in networks has been growing and growing and growing, and so what we get is one of these nice curves that just heads up and up. Now where this will end, who knows? Maybe we'll just become awash in talking about networks, and that's all we'll talk about. But at some point, it'll probably level off with some reasonable level of discourse on networks, just like we talk about other concepts. Okay, so why are networks so cool? Why do people care so much about them? Why have they become so much part of the public discourse? Well, one reason is they're just so fun to look at. So here's a graph of a middle school. The white dots are Caucasian students, the green dots are African American students, and the red dots are students of mixed race. What you see when you look at this graph is that middle school is pretty segregated. You also see some little clumps within the white students and clumps within the black students. Those happen to be boys and girls. So you see that, wow, adolescents tend to segregate by race, and they tend to segregate by gender. Now you can look at adult friendship networks. So this is from the Framingham study, a famous study, where they asked people who their friends are. And this just shows a network of friends. And what you can see is that there's little clusters. So people have close cliques of friends, and they're connected to other people through other friends. So you don't see that same sort of breaking into segregating by race and gender among adults that you'd see among adolescents. And you can also look at email networks within a corporation. You can see here's a person right here who tends to email a lot of other people. And again, by looking at these email networks, you can look at how information flows within the organization, figure out who is important to the organization in terms of that information passing from that person to other people. You can also use networks to look at, as I mentioned, polarization in American society. So this is a network from one of my colleagues, Lotta Adamic, and what she does, which is really interesting, is she paints the liberal bloggers blue and conservative bloggers red, and then she draws links between liberal bloggers as blue lines and links between conservative bloggers as red lines. Then the handful of liberal to conservative links, so this is if a liberal blogger cites a conservative blogger, she makes that yellow, and if a conservative blogger links to a liberal blogger, she colors that purple. So if you look at this graphic, you see there's lots of blue lines, lots of red lines, very few yellow and purple lines. So what this tells us is that discourse on issues is very polarized. Now, there's something that we might think, but by running a network, what we can do is we can see exactly how much there is. And then by doing statistics on the networks, and possibly doing that over time, we can see whether that trend is increasing or decreasing. Now, you can also do some pretty fabulous stuff. This is some work by Dan Katz and his colleagues. He was a student of mine, actually, at the University of Michigan. Now he's a law professor at Michigan State. I think he's taking this class. Hi, Dan. And one of the things Dan did is he looked at the spread of ideas within legal journals. And then he codes the ideas by the school to which they belong. So what you see is you see schools like Harvard, Berkeley, Yale, Michigan, NYU, Columbia in the center of this graph, and also being bigger nodes. And what you've got there is you've got lots of people are connected, lots of ideas are connected to those nodes. So what are we going to do in this set of lectures? So we're really going to focus on three things. First, we're going to focus on the logic of networks. Like, how did they come to be? What rules do people or organizations use to form connections to other people and organizations? Second, we're going to talk about the structure. Once you've got a network, you can ask, what are the measures? How do we compare one network to another? So What are the properties of a network? How many nodes are there? How many edges are there? How connected are they? That sort of stuff. Third thing we're going to do is we're talking about the functionality of the networks. So when you think of a network, it's got some structure to it. We can ask, what does that structure do? So for example, when people talk about social networks, one thing they'll talk about is 6 degrees of separation. In fact, you can get from any one person to any other person through 6 connections. That's a functionality of the network. But what's interesting about that functionality is no one set out to form a network that did that. That just emerges through the process. So here's how you want to think of it. There's a logic through which the network forms. That creates a structure, and then that structure has emergent functionalities, such as the 6 degrees property. So that's how we want to frame this entire discussion. Logic is how it forms. Structure is the measures, how connected are things, how far is it from one person to another, that sort of thing. And then function is what that structure enables the network to do. And often what that structure enables the network to do isn't something that anybody set out to have the network do. So it's an emergent functionality. However, when we study this, we're going to have to do this in a slightly different order. We're going to start out by looking at structure. The reason we're going to do that is we need to be able to define what a network is, what a node is, what an edge is, and just describe networks before we can really talk about how they form. So we're going to switch the order a little bit, but we're going to start out with structure, then we'll move on to the logic, talk about how they form, and then we'll conclude by talking about their functionality. Now this is a very introductory set of notes and thoughts on networks. One of my colleagues, Mark Newman, has recently written a book on networks that sort of starts very simple and then moves you fairly quickly to the frontiers of network theory. So I'd encourage you to pick up this book by Mark or possibly any other book on networks if you really want to do a deeper dive. So this is just really a very thin introduction to what has become a deep, deep area of research where there's lots of interesting results. I'm just going to give you a hint of those in this set of lectures. Okay, so let's get started. It's going to be a lot of fun. We're going to talk about the structure, then the logic, and then the function of networks. Thanks.